It's no secret that if you have an 8-core processor and you're playing a game like Rocket League, you're not really going to need all 8 of those cores. So, what if you wanted to devote some of those cores, but not all of them, to something like mining? How many cores can you mine on without seriously affecting your Rocket League performance? Let's test it out.
The test we are running specifically is Rocket League Drop Shot. The reason for Drop Shot is so that I can play against other players online, and yes, I'm aware that that does add variance when you're measuring online play, but I wanted to give a realistic CPU load here for an esports title. While the graphs are of a single run, the numbers do come from multiple runs of Rocket League. The system we're using does feature an 8-core Ryzen processor clocked at 3.7 GHz. The graphics card we're using is an AMD FirePro W7000, which is basically just a 4GB R9 270. As for the chart in front of us, we have an average of 105 frames per second represented by the black bar here. The 2 bars below it are the 1% and 0.1% lows. All this green squiggly mess is our frame rate over time. If you're not familiar with statistics, math, or any of that, this STDEV stands for standard deviation. And basically what it says is that most of the frames are within 17.78 frames per second of the average 105.25 frames per second. It's a way of measuring how far away from the average our frame rate typically gets. The bigger the standard deviation, the wider the randomness in our frame rate. So for me, using a 60Hz monitor now, this is clearly perfectly fine, with 99% of the frames way over 60 frames per second. If we go ahead and devote one of those 8 cores I have, along with its accompanying SMT thread, to mining, our standard deviation goes up a little bit, and our frame rates drop a little bit, although not significant. And to be quite honest, given online games, it's pretty much the same as before. Devoting 2 out of 8 cores to mining, again, largely unchanged. With 3 out of the 8 cores mining, you can see that our standard deviation is indeed slowly climbing up, and our frame rate is largely unchanged, although our 1% low has now dropped to 60 frames per second, whereas it was over 70 with nothing mining, and our 0.1% low is slightly down, but not much. Adding a 4th core into the mix, our average frame rate largely unchanged, our 1% low now under 60 frames per second, our 0.1% low still slowly decreasing. Something that is not slowly decreasing is the standard deviation, which is now noticeably increasing. And one thing that you'll start to notice visually here in the chart is how hairy it gets. Much like that one creepy uncle and his ears, it gets hairier as time progresses. Especially when we add that 5th core into the mix. While our average frame rate is still in the slightly over 100 frames per second mark, our 0.1% low and 1% low are definitely still down there, and our standard deviation is now starting to get a little out of control here. Now that I'm at 6 out of 8 cores, we are starting to see that average frame rate finally die down. Whereas we were at 104 to 106 frames per second before, we are now down to 90. Our 1% and 0.1% lows are definitely down there, and our standard deviation is very much up there. It was at this point that the game started to feel like it was maybe running at 50 frames per second. It didn't really stand out as unplayable or super unpleasant, but it was noticeably not as smooth. At this point, because I was so driven by curiosity, I threw in another core for mining. And at this point, it really felt like I was playing at 30 frames per second. Even though the frame rate average was still 90, the standard deviation was so high and our lows were so low that it was very unpleasant to play. but not nearly as unpleasant as it was with 8 cores. With all 8 cores mining, and essentially just running Rocket League across all the SMT threads, it was not a pleasant experience. I mean, just look at the standard deviation compared to the average. It really doesn't get much worse than this. The game really felt like I was playing a PowerPoint slideshow, and it really was that bad. This curve represents what no mining looks like. You can see that our peak frame rate, or the most common occurrence, is up here at 104 frames per second, and it's pretty grouped around that 100 frame per second mark. But if we compare that to the distribution of frames that we got in that last run with 8 out of 8, the frame rate is noticeably over a much wider area, the peak frame rate is much lower, and we get a lot more frames approaching 0 frames per second than we did before.
In summary, you can devote some cores to mining, yes, and make a few dollars, and still play a game such as Rocket League. So, I think that's about all you can conclude from that data set. So, if you have any other games you'd like me to test, leave those comments down below. If you're willing to watch the videos, I'm willing to make them and get that ad revenue. So please, let me know some suggestions down below. If you're still in the mood for watching some more tech videos, make sure to check out these over here and subscribe for more. I'll see you next time. See you then.